Bree Fulton on the SBL team is going to give you an introduction on the waste diversion program and a bit about the progress that we've made here at the lab, a bit about AB 1383, which is a kind of a real imperative we have here in California because food waste does lead to very strong climate pollutants such as methane. And the reason that we're all here today is to kind of bring that home and talk about closing the loop at home by composting at home, and hopefully we'll all bring that back to work when we get back to work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some basics on home composting, and then we have Howdy Gowdy from ETA to give us some more in-depth tips and ideas and methods and kind of some of his own experience. And then I hope folks will stop at any time with questions, and that we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. So we have one presentation. I'm going to go ahead and kind of manage that and move the slides forward so we don't have to switch back and forth. So with that, I'm going to, any questions maybe before we get started? Unmute yourself and ask any questions before we get started. Okay, are you ready, Bree? Take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today to talk about composting. It's nice to see so many people here. And thank you, Karen, for the introduction and the overview of the topic. I'm going to be pretty short and just give an overview, like Karen said, of our waste diversion program at the lab and how composting fits into all of that. So we have a program, you guys are probably all familiar with our waste stations, the colorful bins you see in the hallway. We audit what is in those bins. So we literally sort through the trash in the buildings and weigh it and see what's going where. And so we do this to try to get a sense of where we are so we know where the areas of improvement are and figure out how we can get there. We've been doing this for about a little over 2 years. We've done over 100 audits, generally about 2 to 4 for each building. Larger buildings have more audits, smaller buildings have less. And it's interesting that what we see has a lot of consistency across the buildings. And what you see on this slide right here is the results of the latest round of audits. And so this doesn't represent every single audit that was done, just the most recent audit from each building. And I want to stress that this is just the waste coming from buildings that users are generating. So this is the stuff, oh, Karen, can you go back? Thank you. This is just the stuff that you put in those bins in the hallways or in the bin under your desk. There are other types of waste at the lab that go into large dumpsters. There's also construction waste. There's also scrap metal. And so the diversion rate you see here, if you see the 61%, this is just representing that waste from the buildings. Overall, we have a site-wide diversion rate, and that's actually at 75% because we are taking so many other types of waste into consideration. That includes a lot of scrap metal, which is very heavy, so it boosts our rate a lot. And so that's how we get from 61% diversion, things being diverted from the landfill in the buildings, to 75% site-wide because we have landscape waste, which is heavy, and scrap metal waste, which is heavy as well. And that that type of waste gets diverted. So enough about that. So the graph, what you see in front of you. These are the things that went into the bins in the building. So the green slice you see here is compost. And so 31% of all the waste that was thrown away in the buildings went into the compost. And this is by weight. You'll see a 29.6 blue slice. That's from the waste that went into the recycling bins. And this purple slice that says 18.1%, that's what we call recoverables. So those are things that went into the landfill bin, which should have gone into either the compost or the recycling bin. And then the 16.3% you see that's gray, that's landfill. And the other slices are various types of waste that generally went into the wrong bin. It's landfill and recycling, landfill and compost, compost and recycling and compost. So we're here to talk about that green slice compost. What you can see is that in general, people are doing a good job. And when we look at where our areas for improvement are, we look to mainly this purple slice, which is the recoverables in landfill, which is 18.1%. And so the question there is, well, what is that? And I can tell you that it's mostly stuff that should have gone into the compost, and I'll tell you why. Karen, can you go on to the next slide, please? So what you see here is what went into the wrong bin, and it shows you where our biggest area for improvement is. It's getting more things into the compost. So if you're thinking about waste diversion at the lab and there's one thing you can do, generally it's going to be to compost more. So this graph right here at the very top, you see on the far right hand side, contamination of landfill. So of everything that went into the landfill bin, 52.6 of it should have gone into the compost or recycling. Of that 52.6%, 25% of it was soiled paper that went into the landfill. So these paper towels, it's generally used paper towels. We see them everywhere. It's the frequently most misplaced item. People put it in the landfill, people put it in the recycling, and people put it in the compost, and that's where it's supposed to go. Mostly people, when they get it wrong, they put it into the landfill, but sometimes people think, oh, it's paper, it should go into the recycling. And so sometimes they put it into the recycling as well. And it's heavy. I mean, paper absorbs water, so it has a good amount of weight to it. So it is comprises by weight a big source of the contamination. And right underneath that, you see food waste in landfill. So that's 18.6%. So if you put those two together, you can see that compostables, just with those two items, comprise a lot of the stuff that's going into the landfill that should be going into the compost. And I won't get into all those other items below, but there are a good portion of things that should have gone into the compost with those as well. So that's just a little bit of insight into what's happening at the lab in terms of compostables that are generated by everyday users, where we can improve. And so the reason, the place these are mostly going is into people's under desk bins. So if people get up and they go to the waste stations, they generally pick the right bin. They look at the signs. Maybe they already know about our waste guide, which is wasteguide.lbl.gov. It's a website that tells you where to put the most frequently encountered items at the lab. If you have any questions, that's the place to go for those answers. But a lot of people, for whatever reason, don't get up and go to the waste station to sort their items. And so the contamination rate, that when I say contamination rate, I mean stuff that goes into the bin that's not supposed to go into the bin. It's pretty low at the waste stations. People are doing a good job of sorting there when they go. But when they don't, the contamination rate there is about 15%. But if people don't go to those and they just throw it in their under desk bin, the contamination rate is much higher in those under desk bins. Generally about 65% of the stuff that ends up in the bins underneath people's desks shouldn't go there. It should either go into the compost or the recycling. So another one of the takeaways from this is if you have an under desk bin, consider giving it up. and going and taking that waste to the waste station yourself. We do give out little mini desk side composting bins because sometimes it's just a pain. Generally, stuff you want to throw away is compostable. And I want to give a shout out to the IGB building because they decided to be the first zero waste building. What we mean by that is nobody has an underdesk bin in that building. They all get up and they all take their waste to the central waste stations. And a lot of them do have those little desktop composting bins, and they're doing a really good job. And it's been a pretty great experience to work with them and see the successes they've gotten from their efforts. So we're hoping that they are going to be the leaders by example and that other buildings will take on the same challenge of getting rid of their underdesk bins and making the transition to sorting their own waste. So if you could go to the next slide, Karen. I want to talk about the legislation that's driving California and also helping to move the lab in the right direction. So there is a bill that was recently passed statewide called SB 1383 that addresses short-lived climate pollutants. And so those are gases like methane and other greenhouse gases that are particularly potent. So methane is about 22 to 24 times as potent as carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So it's of particular concern to climate change. And when landfilled, organic waste is one of the largest sources of methane pollution in California. And this is something we can do something about. Organic waste accounts for about 2/3 of the state's waste stream, and more than 5.5 million tons of food is dumped into landfills every year. And so this is dual-fold. The issues that this causes, one is, obviously there's a link between the climate change and what we're disposing of in our waste stream. And also a lot of this food that's thrown away is edible food. So SB 1383 wants to address both of those. California is the first state to mandate this universal composting. And that is, we're supposed to reduce, Cal Recycle, the state waste authority, is tasked with reducing organic waste disposal by 75% from 2014 levels by 2025. And in addition, recover 20% of the edible food that is thrown away by 2025. So this can address people throwing away food that is very much needed by other people who don't have enough food, and also tackle climate change at the same time. In California right now, most places in the Bay Area, you probably have a compost bin that you can put out to your curb and it can be picked up by the waste hauler. But this isn't the case in a lot of places in California, which still don't have curbside composting. This is a really heavy lift by the state, and there's a lot to do to get all municipalities to have composting programs to give residents the ability to put their composting out. And also the state has to build a lot of facilities to actually have a place to send this compost for. So it's not just an issue of, waste companies needing to pick this up. It's having the ability to actually compost all the organic waste that's being generated. And so it's a great bill, and there's a lot to do, and people are on our way. So that's just kind of the high level overview. We realize you guys are all at home. You're not even at the lab right now, probably. And so composting has a different meaning right now. You're at home, and maybe you've started a garden. A lot of people started a garden, and you do want to have compost. Maybe your municipality isn't picking up compost right now and you want to compost. So we've put this webinar together for you so you can learn from some of the pros who are already doing it and have somewhere to go, someone to ask questions to as you're troubleshooting your system. And, you know, there's a lot of resources out there that tell you how, but we want to kind of make this more at a micro level to connect you to people in the lab who have more answers and who are experts in their own right. So with that, I'll close out my portion of it and hand it back to Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, Bree. And actually, before we move on, are there any questions for Bree? I mean, obviously you can ask him at the end, but just wanted to make sure we.
I have one. This is Steve Greenberg. Thanks, Bree. Is there is there readily available data building by building about how well people are complying with the waste stream diversion?
Oh, thank you, Steve. That's a great question. Yes, there is. So that first graph I showed you was part of a much larger database of information that's available on our website. If you go to sbl.lbl.gov, there is a category at the top that says data. And if you go there, there is a drop-down menu and it will say waste by building. And you can click on that and you can see, you can drill down and get this type of graph and even more information by building. And you can also see how buildings compare to each other on the overall graph. So check out your building and see how your building's doing.
And that's a great point. I will add that link to the resources page.
That's great. Bree, I had a question.
Hi, Jim.
Jim, yeah, I noticed on if you go back to your slide about, you know, the 25% was, yeah, this one. I didn't see a lot of food contamination of recyclables in here. Isn't that a problem? I mean, I'm just curious if we bring a, you know, some sort of container that is recyclable and there's food waste in it, do we have to clean that out before we put it in the recycling, or is it okay to go into the recycling container with food in it?
Thank you, Jim. That's a good question. So generally you want to clean out the food in your container before you put it in the recycling so that it doesn't contaminate the other recyclables that are in that same container. It takes a while for that container to get to its final destination. And if there's food left over on it, it can cause a problem for a whole lot of other recyclables that are mixed in with it.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't know if like the heat involved in recycling things took care of that problem, or if it just, so it doesn't just magically go away. It's better to clean it.
It doesn't just magically go away. By the time that container actually gets to the place where it's being recycled, it might, but the problem is that the people who are accepting the recycling don't want dirty containers. It can cause mold, it can cause odor issues, and so this, you know, piece of waste is being combined with a whole bunch into a 2,000 pound ton, sorry, I'm getting my words confused. A whole bunch of recyclables go into a bale, and people can accept or reject it based on how contaminated it is. And if they see the mold and the smell and that they think, oh, this is a dirty batch of recyclables, the whole thing gets tossed.
Okay. So why, Bree touched on composting at home. We're hoping to provide you with some tips and knowledge that you'll bring back to the lab when you do return, and also to give you some guidance on things you can do at home. As Bree mentioned, there's curbside pickup in a lot of places around the Bay Area, and most of us probably have that. In some cases it's for food, some cases it's just for yard waste, but it's certainly a great option. You can put your food, soil, paper products in there, you know, all of your food waste, anything organic can go in there, with only a few exceptions. And most municipalities give you good guidance on that. It's great that it's regular pickup. It's a good choice if you can't use compost at your house, if you know no place to put it on your garden or something like that. But as Bree mentioned, it's not necessarily available everywhere, especially the food waste part of it. So we wanted to provide some other options of what you can do at home. And one of the simplest is yard waste composting. If you do have a yard with lawn and, you know, bushes and trees and that sort of thing, those things get cut up. Your lawn gets mown and you cut some of your branches of your trees, you trim your hedges and that kind of thing. All of that yard waste can be composted into a sort of open bin you see here. It's pretty easy. It provides decent compost. It's easy to set up. It's minimal care. It does take a little longer to break down, but and you need a fairly big bin for those large batches of yard waste. And you need to do things like cut down large branches so that they break down in a reasonable period of time, but it's definitely a great option. Another option is to do food scrap composting at home. And so you're going to be collecting food scraps on your countertop, just like you would if you were dumping it into your curbside bin, but it needs to be vegan. It can't be any animal products except eggshells. You don't want any bread in there, any milk products or anything like that. So there's a limit to what you can put in there, but it does provide a rich compost. Some other.
Kelly.
Sorry.
因为每次去了。
Can folks?
我推着上的那个service停了。
Can people mute themselves, please, if you're not asking a question? Thank you. So you do have, because you are putting food in, you're going to prefer something that's sealed so you can deter pests. You can include yard waste. And for both food scrap composting as well as worm composting, which I'll touch on just next, you do want a balance of greens, which would be food waste or fresh greenery like leaves and things like that, as well as things that are called browns, and that would be dead leaves, sticks, paper, cardboard, and that balance is really going to help your compost develop well. And just note that large dense items like carrot tops and avocado pits and big branches and stuff don't break down quickly. So they may need to kind of get thrown back into the bin for another few cycles, but you can maybe cut them up or something like that to help them break down. So worm composting, and I have this sort of guide here at the top, what's kind of easiest to do versus things that take a little more care and feeding, if you will. Worm composting is very similar to food composting in terms of what, just your regular food scrap composting in terms of what you can put in. But the additional restriction is that you really want to minimize how much citrus and how much allium product, with onions and garlic and things like that go in there, because it's a real deterrent to the worms. So it just doesn't, your compost won't be as successful. But it definitely provides the best compost because the worms just do a fabulous job of turning food into soil. And it is the option to choose if you have minimal space. You can even, I know some people keep their worm bin under their sink, but you do have to make sure you keep it in the shade wherever it is. And it's a good idea to weigh down the cover to help deter pests, although pests are a little less of an issue with the worm bin. And you do have to put a little more effort into monitoring the moisture and the temperature. So that's kind of the overview of the different types, the general different types of composting that you can do at home. And one thing that I wanted to note is that, takeout packaging is probably best to avoid in your home compost, and maybe even in your curbside pickup, depending on what your curbside pickup rules are. There's just they certainly in backyard compost, the packaging is not as compostable as we would like, and some of it has some plasticizers in it, so it's best to avoid it. So just some basics about your countertop food scrap collection. Many of you probably do this already, but you want to collect your food scraps in a countertop bin, and obviously you empty it into to your either your curbside or your exterior bin as often as you need to. And occasionally you want to just rinse and let it air dry out periodically, just to keep the, keep it from smelling and that sort of thing. One thing that I do, because you need to put browns in your home compost to have that balance, is I actually, if I have like paper bags or, brown packing paper that I get in a package, is I put a little bit of that on the bottom of my bin, and that can absorb some additional moisture and just keep the bin from getting too wet, and makes it also easier to dump out. But in general, liners it's not necessary. And certainly for curbside pickup, you're not needing to add browns necessarily. So one thing you can do if you want is to, you can get compostable produce bags in the supermarket when you're getting your produce, and you can reuse those. And I would say avoid buying compost bags for your bin, because the goal here is to recycle and to, reuse what you've already got rather than, putting new things in. And those bags will definitely not compost well in your backyard composter. So, so they're just use them sparingly for curbside. So with that, I'm going to so maybe I should stop there and just see if anyone has any questions so far, and then I'm going to turn it over to Howdy for some more detail. All right.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I recently picked up some compost from the Berkeley monthly free compost pickup out by the marina. And it stinks really bad. And so I'm kind of wondering if there's anything you would recommend to help reduce the smell. I've been told it doesn't usually smell this bad, and there's a variety of reasons why it could smell, but yeah. Yeah.
So I don't have an exact answer for you, and I'm hoping that maybe someone else on the call will. But what I would say is this is one of the benefits of composting in your own backyard, is that you know what you've put in there, and you can manage it yourself and make sure you have a good balance and tend to it. And obviously, when you get municipal compost, it's kind of hard to tell what's been put, what's in there and why it might smell. So I don't know. Is anyone else on the call, maybe Howdy, have an idea of what Lauren could do about the smelly compost she's picked up?
Karen, go ahead, Howdy.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I've had that issue when I had too much kitchen waste in my tumbler, and so I've mitigated that to some extent by putting grass clippings and more brown. I had too rich of a mixture, I think, of kitchen waste, and that can really smell terrible. So that's one thing. But I was also curious, if I may ask one other question. I know that I was at UC Santa Cruz, and they talked about composting and the need to hit a certain temperature in order to kill the pathogens in it. And I'm wondering if you could add any suggestions on that, just because one of the things I've been concerned about is if my compost doesn't hit a certain temperature and I'm not killing the pathogens, is it safe to put in my garden?
I'll talk about temperature a little bit, and also maybe this issue of smells. I mean, I don't know the exact answer in that industrial composting example, but one of the larger issues for smells, which you just identified, Jim, was you don't want it to go anaerobic, because earlier on it was mentioned that food waste in the landfill is a source of methane, which is a greenhouse gas, and it's the anaerobic decomposition without enough access to oxygen that causes the methane production and a lot of odors. So usually just aeration, like you were mentioning, mixing it in with other materials, dry materials, and loose fill to kind of aerate it is important if you have really wet, gloppy food waste. And you don't want to just let that sit at the bottom of a container for a long time or in a bin in those kinds of conditions, which is why managing the moisture level in any compost bin is an important aspect. But yeah, why the industrial compost would be delivered in that condition, and if it would still persist after being spread out and being well aerated, I don't know. But it does point out that, you know, industrial scale compost is being put in a position of having to process a lot of material. It's great that the state has these goals and is really pushing forward on organic waste diversion, but the conditions at those facilities aren't always ideal. I mean, they should be able to do the right thing, but I mean, I've definitely heard that they're not, you know, pleasant smelling places, and they may not always have the optimal conditions. So at least when you're doing your own composting, you know what the situation is, and you can manage it, and you know, you can get a better outcome, hopefully. So
Can I ask a couple follow-up questions on that? Where
I wanted to add one thing about the industrial composting. You know, Karen touched lightly on the takeout packaging, and there are, it's kind of a problematic part of the industrial compost in California and all places right now, is that there's a lot more than these industrial composting facilities ideally want. A lot of times they sort it out. A lot of times this, the PLA, which is a type of plastic, plant-based plastic, gets in there, and it's not really ideal for making compost. And as you're thinking about using that compost from the Berkeley Marina, using it on food might not be the best if you're putting it in a garden bed. I've heard people caution against that because, like Howdy and Karen said, you don't exactly know what is in it. And so it's another reason why you might want to consider making your own.
there is testing. It has to meet a certain level, but, you know, ultimately, whatever people are putting in their street side containers is entering that stream, and some of it gets sorted out, some of it doesn't, and, you know, it's a little bit of a grab bag. But sorry, you had an additional comment?
is it okay for me to use like a little bit of leftover I had from that to start my own compost? Or maybe not recommended considering its issues, or?
You know, it's really up to you. I wouldn't see a huge issue with it. And as we'll get into, you know, creating the right sort of mix of materials and conditions is helpful. And so if you're starting out and you just have a few items, you know, it's, yeah, having a media that's sort of conducive to melding things together may be helpful, but it's certainly not needed to start a compost. I don't think it would hurt. And in terms of contamination, it's just whatever your comfort level is with it, or how pure you're trying to keep your own compost for a certain purpose. But I mean, I don't want to make it sound like an industrial compost is super scary. I mean, it's held to standards. It's just, it's a big open system, and it's a little challenging to keep it completely controlled.
Okay, thank you.
You want to take it away, Howdy?
Yeah, so my name is Howdy. I'm really just kind of a casual composter. I wouldn't consider myself super expert, but I've been composting a while, or I guess more accurately, I've watched compost happen, because the human is in some point, you know, the least critical organism in this. I mean, it's really reliant on all the soil biology and bugs and insects and worms that they can actually do composting. I can just watch it and try to help it along. So, you know, Karen laid out this sort of continuum of different, you know, sources of materials, and you know, the idea is that if you're really just focused on generating compost from yard waste, that can be sort of more simple in that you don't have to worry about excluding pests as much. You can have these kind of open bins. In all composting, the balance of greens and browns is important. And I guess to be a little more scientific about it, what people are usually talking about there is the ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And if you start researching it, you'll see these different ratios that are recommended. And it is important, and it's a topic that you can really get deep into, but in the end, I think you have to sort of relax the rigidity. I mean, you're never going to have the ideal mixture just because you're using materials that are coming off your property or out of your food waste. And so you want to maintain balance, but you don't have to be super strict about it. And even with those ratios, they might say a certain carbon nitrogen ratio, but then it depends how much carbon and nitrogen's in your material, so you can't necessarily balance it by volume or by weight or even by color, because some browns are really high in nitrogen and some greens might have more or less carbon. Or so, I mean, traditionally greens are considered nitrogen sources and browns carbon sources, but it's not a perfect analogy, and ratios change, and so it's a challenging thing to be very attentive to that ratio. It's just good to be aware of it. And as I said, we're watching the compost, and that means you're sort of observing if things are going in the right direction or not, and trying to nudge them one way or the other. But I don't really approach it from I'm going to build my pile right now and I'm going to have exactly such and such ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And as I said, aeration is really important. You want to prevent things from getting really waterlogged or wet, and but you want good moisture to facilitate all the microbes. And then the other idea is just to really think about, especially for yard waste, it can be really impressive how much biomass you can generate on a small city lot even. So if those of you who have curbside collection of green waste, if you do a big yard maintenance project, you can probably fill that up in no time, and lugging it out to the street, you're probably pretty impressed how much weight is going out to the curb. And to the extent that you don't get the municipal compost back, that's leaving your property. That biomass is not coming back. And composting it on site and using it to return nutrients to the plants you want to grow is closing the loop at home, and you don't need to have inputs from outside, going to the nursery and buying some fertilizer or something. So it's just kind of a sensible practice to minimize external inputs and all the external infrastructure of processing and hauling waste when you can manage it on site. So next slide. And so the same goes for food waste. You're kind of closing the loop at home, although in this case, it's resources coming from farms that grew your food that you're going to benefit from. So in an ideal world, they would get that nutrition back on their soil because they need it too. But food scraps are a really valuable resource in terms of good compostable material, and they will provide a lot of nutrition to your own growing needs on your home if you need it. And the things that you have to be aware of, though, are, as Karen mentioned, food waste can be more attractive to pests. And so the standard advice is no meat and dairy, stick to fruit and vegetables. eggshells are fine. But you're still going to have the potential to attract pests, and just make sure you're using a bin that has good exclusion, and monitor that it's not being defeated, because I have this picture of a plastic mesh there as a bottom for a bin that would go up from there, and that works fine in a lot of cases. But I've seen instances where rodents have chewed through plastic bins and through the sides of them, not even through the bottom, and so as I said, I think a fair portion of good composting practice is just observation and making sure things aren't going awry, and looking for that kind of activity and then excluding it, because you can make a good secure food composting bin, and pests will not be an issue. Again, moisture, aeration, turning. There are very nice bins like is pictured here, which is an elevated rotating bin, and that's a great solution that can be very secure. I think that one is also insulated, which is probably more about working in colder climates as well. But there is kind of a philosophy about where your decomposers are coming from, and so having some contact with the ground, whether it's screened or just sort of close proximity, you will get more little insects and beetles and things that help the process. That doesn't mean you need that. I mean, the microbes that are just on the food waste that you throw in the bin is probably a sufficient population to do the work, but it's just worth understanding there are these different sort of ecosystems of decomposers that can be employed, and you might want to think about or observe what you're actually getting, or what what activity you have. So next slide. And along those lines, worms are great great processors and decomposers of waste. And if you have a screened container sitting on soil, you'll probably get worms moving up into it, because they're gonna find the conditions they like, which is decomposing material, and they'll help to decompose it. So you don't even necessarily have to put worms in it, but those will be earthworms that are already in your surrounding areas. What people mostly talk about when they're talking about worm composting is red worms. It's a smaller worm, and they are very specialized decomposers. They want to live in really rich environments of decomposing material, so they don't live in the normal soil. They won't escape and spread into your surrounding garden, because they really need the conditions of lots of decomposing waste, and they do a great job. Often they're in a designated kind of closed bin, like is pictured here, that can be in a garage or patio. Even if you're just have a balcony in an apartment or something, you can have one of these, or as Karen said, it can even be indoors. I mean, they don't smell, and they are very self-contained and clean, but it is, as all compost, it's a living thing, and the different tolerances to environmental factors will vary depending on what organisms you're talking about. But moisture is important. You don't want the worms to get too saturated in their media, and temperature. You don't want them to bake and dry out. Because these containers are, these are sort of the commercial containers. There's a lot of designs you can find on the web for building these yourself out of, you know, Rubbermaid bins or things like that. But most of the designs do kind of focus around collecting this liquid at the base of the container, and they refer to it as worm tea. It's a nice nutrient-rich liquid that you can put directly around plants. But you do have to actually harvest that and prevent it from building up and saturating the areas where the worms are living on these higher tiers. And, you know, it's not really essential that worms have to be in this very specialized container system. As I said, there's lots of homemade versions you can find, but I've actually just we've had one of these bins for many years, and then I just introduced the red worms into our normal, you know, closed but outdoor, you know, typical 30-year-old Smith & Hawken plastic, you know, recycling bin, and they've been doing great in there. And I don't use the previous one any longer. So next slide. So, you know, temperature came up, and the temperature is very tied to that initial discussion of.
Patty, can I interrupt for just a sec? We have a couple of comments on chat that I wanted to share with the group. One of them is from Pat Young, who said that, you know, just in terms of sourcing the worms, she was able to get them from a local tackle shop. You can order them online, and you can also get them from other people who worm compost. That people are typically very willing to give them away. And John wanted to share a resource called "Worms Eat My Garbage," which is a book that folks might be interested in, although there's obviously tons of stuff on the internet in terms of starting worm composting. So I just wanted to share those two thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. No, I also read the Worms Eat My Compost book, and it's in the resource list. But yeah, the internet's covered in worms, just like your compost will be covered in worms. So this is a picture of a worm compost bin, actually my bin. But we were talking about temperature, and so it's kind of tied up in this carbon nitrogen ratio. When you get the conditions just right, you get this burst of you know, the right microbes working, and you get this elevated temperature compost, which is very effective and fast and has some beneficial aspects, like you were saying, can kill certain pathogens. Well, it also kills weed seeds. You know, if you've got a mixture of undesirable seeds in your compost, by using that compost again, you can just proliferate more seeds. So one way to deal with that is just avoid putting viable seed into your compost that you don't want to propagate, but also, you know, the hot compost will deal with it. The industrial compost is designed to be the hot process, but I would say for home purposes, I have rarely achieved hot compost, and maybe that's just because I'm, you know, a lazy composter. I'm not fastidious about ratios and stuff, but I just don't have the right materials at the right time to put it all together and make it happen. So we basically just do slow cold composting with or without worms, and I've gravitated towards doing it with worms because they're so effective. Obviously, hot compost and worms don't mix because that's not their environment. You know, there's some hot microbe that likes that environment, but not, you know, a worm wants to stay cool. So, you know, I think just for practical reasons, while there are some benefits to hot composting, unless you're really dedicated to achieving the right conditions for it, I wouldn't see that as a necessary or, you know, essential goal or outcome. You can do composting just fine at lower temperatures with the understanding of its limitations. It will be slower, and you won't necessarily be able to get rid of certain things. But in general, I don't know that pathogens are a huge problem. I mean, part of the reason you're not putting, meat and milk products into the compost is to avoid pathogens that would be a problem for humans. And then, just want to return to this idea that, compost is alive. This is living communities of all kinds of different species of microbes, fungus, worms, beetles, all kinds of actors are possibly present. They might not all be, and part of your job is tending your compost is just observing and nudging things in certain directions. So I think that's probably it for now. Oh, sorry, we had one more slide. So the same thing goes for food scrap composting. You are closing the loop. You have these really valuable nutrients that you can return to growing your own plants. So it's especially a closed loop system. If you're growing your own vegetables, composting waste, and then returning it to those same beds that you're growing more vegetables from. And if you want, to kind of get immersed in the, the closed loop philosophy, How to Grow More Vegetables by John Jevons is really good, because it's a vegetable focused book, but it's very heavy on compost in terms of, he even advocates growing compost crops so that you're able to grow enough biomass to return the necessary nutrients to your own soil to grow more vegetables. So it's really trying to close the loop and not bring in external inputs. And not everyone has to be that fastidious about providing all their fertility on site. And if you have a small space, it's not even possible. But because we are bringing in so much food from outside and have food scraps, I think fertility on a home garden is really never a problem, and you don't need external inputs because you have enough from your own composted material and food scraps that you compost. Applying compost, it's really simple. You just mix it in with the soil. If you're planting a new bed, you can incorporate it, liberally. If you're planting around, or if you want to apply it around a plant that's already planted, you don't want to disrupt its roots, but you can apply it to the base and, lightly integrate it or water it in. As I said, worm tea can apply sort of the liquid with nutrients. There's even this concept of compost tea, which people take compost that was created in a normal compost bin and basically dip it in water in a cheesecloth with aerated bubbling activity and create a liquid amendment that way. And I'm just presenting these not because it's the only or best way to do it, just to show sort of the spectrum of things that people do with compost. And I think that's it.
Great, thank you, Howdy. So I'm going to land us on this resources page. We've got a lot here. I think maybe not everything is on the link, but I will make sure that everything here is on the link that is in the invite. But I would like to ask if there are any other questions folks have for me or Howdy or Bree, or just in general.
Yeah, thanks, Howdy. It's Steve Greenberg. Yeah, there's kind of a variant on that compost tea, which is a lot less high tech, and that is simply to take the compost once it's more or less completed and just mix it with water and use that as a liquid fertilizer for the plants.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's really about trying to help get the nutrients where they need to go. So if you just put dry compost on the surface, it may just, volatilize, and you'll lose your nitrogen and your fertility out the surface before it has a chance to get into the plant. So that's why you want to water it in, or as Steve said, you can mix it with water and then apply it. But as the previous warning, you don't want to just have compost sitting in water for long periods of time, because that's just a anaerobic problem. So, it's really sort of a delivery mechanism and trying to percolate the nutrients down into the soil, but not create anaerobic, conditions.
Any other questions?
I have a question. We found in the house that we moved into, we found a composting bin called the Earth Machine, and it's pretty kind of sealed. It's not open to influx of air. Is that okay?
Well, you want aeration. I mean, I'm not sure I've ever seen a compost bin that had, really no provision for air, because as I said, you'll get anaerobic conditions. But maybe it's just not obvious how it's aerated. I mean, like the earlier photo of the rotating bin, it looks pretty sealed up, but I'm sure, Karen, you can attest to, it has vents somewhere that you can see a little hole in one side, or
Yeah, there are holes along the sides here where you can see this little circle. There's holes, and then there's also holes in between the two sides. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have another question related to, you talked about at the end putting the compost, kind of adding it to the soil when you're planting, or like adding it on top of something. So if I'm not starting with other non-compost soil, is that okay? Or should I be purchasing some sort of potting soil? I don't have like my own yard. I live in a house, but like I'm stuck with using pots and doing other things too.
No, in general, adding compost to whatever base soil you have is going to make it better soil, especially in the Bay Area, where we have a lot of clay. Clay is actually good, nutritious soil, but it's very heavy, and when it dries out, it gets, kind of like a rock, and so it benefits a lot from having compost mixed into it, because then it helps the airspace and water holding capacity of the soil. So yeah, if you're starting a new bed and you've dug to loosen it up, incorporating a lot of compost to the base soil you have can really help get it into a state where it will be more productive. But over time, you won't necessarily need to do that every year, and you could just apply some compost to the top. But as Steve was mentioning, you want to water it in, or just lightly incorporate it enough so that you're not just losing the nutrients before they have a chance to incorporate.
So if I have a pot and I plant a plant in it, it's not good to just plant it in compost on its own?
Well, plants are pretty amazing. They'll grow in lots of media. Compost alone, depending on what its state is, will generally work. I mean, one of the things I didn't mention, we talked about, cold composting doesn't kill weed seeds, right? So one of the things that happens in cold compost is you put in a lot of fruits and vegetables, right? What do they have? They have seeds. And so if you don't kill those seeds, most of them will come back. And so we, commonly have lots of stuff growing out of compost, volunteers. And sometimes, it might be in a, we've had times where we've filled a bag with, compost, and pretty soon a tomato's coming out of it, and we actually grow and harvest tomatoes out of this tomato that's just growing in a bag of compost. It's not the ideal way to do it, but it works. So, I mean, if you have some other soil to mix in with your potted plant, I think a mixture of soil and compost might be more reliable, just because depending on the composition of the compost, it's likely to be missing something that's, you know, not going to perform as ideally as something that has a more complete, you know, soil profile. But you can get away with a lot. Nature is pretty forgiving, including all the composters. I mean, you know, a lot of the advice, like Karen said, you know, don't overdo it on onions and citrus. And it's like, it's true. Yeah. Anything you are feeding to a living thing, it's like you can do it too much, the wrong way, whatever. But it can be surprising how resilient and tolerant they are. So we've had a lot of citrus in our worm bins in the past and not experienced a problem. So
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's a little past the hour, so I'm going to close it off here, but I would welcome you to reach out to me or to Howdy, and also to take a look at the link that I shared in the invite for a link to this presentation. I'll also be posting the recording there, and all of these resources. So thank you very much for joining us, and happy composting.